for a moment, please. Actually, nice to be on stage, albeit being dripped on slightly. So if water drips on us, please ignore that. Also, please ignore us being in socks to preserve the set. We were joking before that it's possibly slightly hard to have a very serious conversation in socks, but we will do our best. Welcome in, ladies and gentlemen, to this forum, co-hosted by Griffin and by the Purves Environmental Fund. And can I start by thanking the Purves Environmental Fund as well. I'm Sam Strong. I'm the artistic director of Griffin and the director of the show as well. And speaking of wearing multiple hats, I will also be lucky enough to be facilitating the forum today. Before I introduce the speakers, some of whom you may know, I just want to provide a little bit of context about the event. For some time here at Griffin, we've been experimenting with, in some ways, turning the kind of 90 minutes that you might spend in this theatre into events. So putting various things before, during and after those shows as a way of kind of heightening or intensifying audiences' experiences. So this forum is a case in point, and we thought that, given that we're dealing with a play that tackles the question of climate change, that it would be a good opportunity for us to broaden that discussion out a bit. I imagine most of you have seen the show, or some of you here today have seen the show, and as you'll know if you've seen the show, Ian Meadows is sitting to my left, Play Between Two Waves is a play that kind of asks how we deal in a personal and immediate way with what is a very global and long-term question. We thought, given that the play tackles that question, we might broaden out to some different perspectives and some different experiences on that question, and specifically asking that question of how do we address that tipping point, if you like, of social awareness becoming social action. If we move beyond questions about whether or not climate change exists, how do we kind of turn knowing about it into doing something about it, particularly when it's a kind of well-known issue. So that's the sort of background for the forum today. To talk through the format of it, each speaker who I'll introduce in a moment will speak for approximately 10 minutes, and then we'll open the floor to questions, and I'm joined by writer and director Ian Meadows as well for some questions at the end, and we'll be out of here in about an hour, I think. To introduce the panel before we talk in detail about them, from the left we have Natalie Isaacs, who is the founder of 1 Million Women. To Natalie's right, or to my left, is John Connor, who is the CEO of the Climate Institute. And to John's right is Kirsty Albion, who is the co-director of the Australian Youth Climate Coalition. We'll ask Natalie to speak first. To introduce Natalie, I have some notes here somewhere. Here we go. Natalie, so I don't get this wrong. Natalie is mother of 4 with a deep concern about the world her children are inheriting. After training in aromatherapy and natural therapies in London as a young woman, she came home to Australia in 1986 to found and run her own business. In 2006, Natalie saw an urgent need to utilise her skills and passion as a businesswoman and communicator to take real and significant action on climate change. She orchestrated the launch of the 1 Million Women campaign in mid-2009. Natalie's vision is for a non-partisan, practical action-focused campaign that can reach women everywhere and help them to drive change in their daily lives. That is household energy, food, fashion, shopping, transport and travel. Her philosophy is one of taking personal responsibility. Natalie Isaacs from 1 Million Women. You can do whatever you like.
Dance?
Yeah. As long as it's in socks, it's okay.
Well, thank you very much for having me here today to talk. And God, it's hard to talk after that was just such a powerful and amazing play, and it brings a lot of things back, things that I haven't thought about for a while. But I do need to tell you that I'm actually not some long-term green role model, even though I'm the founder of 1 Million Women. I only got the point on all of this. I only got the point on climate change in the middle of 2006. And I used to be a cosmetics manufacturer, so I was in Fiona's shopping centre. I was the one that had the products on the shelves that were covered in packaging. We used to manufacture skincare products for all the department stores for Christmas, and it makes me actually feel ill when I think about the ridiculous amounts of packaging that I used to put on our Christmas lines, and those those products under people's trees and just being ripped off and chucked in the bin for some very small product. It actually does make me sick, but anyway, I digress. I used to have my head buried in the sand. I went along thinking that I was just one person, so surely one person can't make a difference in all of this, and change has got to happen from governments, and I guess I just, do what I'm told. And I could actually sit around a dinner table and talk about climate change. I could talk about the issues, but I would leave the dinner table and just carry on business as usual. So for me, there was this real deep disconnect about being aware of climate change and then actually doing anything about it. I mean, I was really quite bad. I didn't even have recycling sorted. I just was disconnected. And I think that, it's a fundamental flaw in a lot of us. When you don't know enough about something, it is really quite easy to just shy away from it and do nothing. And for me, it was this fear of not knowing enough about climate change, not understanding what was being said out there, and I didn't want to. I was a fear of embarrassment or seeming silly, so I just literally didn't do anything about it. But somewhere in the middle of 2006, there was this huge shift in public awareness on climate change, and the media got the point, and the media started talking about climate change in language that I could actually understand, and I actually finally got the point. I actually, in the middle of 2006, internalised climate change. I actually felt it. I realised that this was not someone else's issue, that it was not someone else's problem. It was actually all about me. It was all about my family. It was all about my friends. It was all about our future. And so I just decided to stop mucking around, stop having all these excuses why I wasn't doing anything, and I decided to act. And look, the first thing I did was get the household electricity bill down by 20%. And it was at that point of taking action and seeing a result, it was right then that I took ownership of the problem. I took ownership of the issue. And as you do, I started a climate action campaign. With a girlfriend of mine, we started 1 Million Women. And the vision was really big from the start. We wanted to reach women like me, like I was, just not engaged on this issue for whatever reason. We wanted to reach women from the city to the bush, and so we came up with this concept, 1 Million Women. And the aim of 1 Million Women is to empower, it's to motivate, but most importantly, it's to mobilise women to take practical action on climate change, but to focus on what's personal and what's local, to focus on living more sustainably, to focus on our day-to-day lives, that's food and shopping and everything that we do in our lives, to focus on that. And so when you join 1 Million Women, you make this personal commitment to cut a ton of pollution out of your life in a year. So you go to the website, you follow the prompts, and there is this activity centre which has 50 different ways to cut pollution right now. You have the activity, the pollution value attached to that activity if you do it for a month or a year. And it is this really clear, these clear guidelines. If I do this, this is the result. And although the call to action is to cut a ton of pollution, the ultimate aim of 1 Million Women is to truly and profoundly change behaviour and get engaged in this issue. We launched just a little over 3 years ago. We have 77,000 women who've joined the campaign. We have 35,000 on our Facebook site, and more than 9,000 women have come to a 1 Million Women event. And although I know that's a really bloody long way to 1 million, I do think that it's 77,000 women that aren't just ticking a box and just saying, okay, you know, I've done that. I can tick my, you know, I can tick that box and I'm done. It's really about focusing on changing behaviour. And we're focused on women because, well, every campaign needs a niche market, and women are a pretty powerful one. But women make more than 70% of the consumer decisions that affect the household's carbon footprint. We are incredible we're natural networkers, we have huge influence in the consumer marketplace, and we're more than 50% of the Australian electorate, so we are a pretty powerful force. And so the campaign just, you know, it just speaks to the unique strengths of women. But the campaign, the ultimate aim is to connect. It is to find those touch points that reach women, because we're a women's movement, but that reach women emotionally and personally. Because for a long time, I wasn't connected emotionally and personally, and then something happened and I had an epiphany and I changed. And that's what the focus of 1 Million Women is, to find those touch points. Because, you know, it's about changing behaviour, and changing behaviour is an incredibly difficult thing to do. You know, it's about, when it comes to the environment, so many of us still consider looking after the environment as an adjunct to life. You know, I go along doing this, and I do this for the environment as well. And I was always surprised when I started 1 Million Women, when I have some people come up to me say, oh, Nat, geez, I mean, we have busy lives as it is, and now you're telling me I've got to try and fit this in and this in and this in. You know, I'm just not going to be able to do it. And it's just, that's the wrong approach, because this isn't about being an adjunct to life. It's about, it's about life. But I think that the way that we change behaviour is that we have to actually get ourselves outside of that traditional framework in this country of our high consumption society, and that it's actually not good enough to try and change behaviour within that framework, because we simply, you know, if we push in that we're not getting ourselves far enough outside of our comfort zone. And I think to truly and honestly be able to change behaviour, you have to internalise climate change. And at that moment you do, it is really quite easy to change. It's really quite easy, and I know that for sure, because that's exactly what happened to me. I went along, I internalised climate change, and I have been able to change my behaviour in absolutely every aspect of my life, right through to the pressure I put on governments, through to what I will spend my money on, what brands I support, the way that I focus on food, the way that our family runs. And I guess that is the essence of 1 Million Women. It is about, it's about taking along the journey of empowerment. It's about giving bite-sized actions in our lives that give real and tangible results. And that actually, it just doesn't matter if you don't know all about the politics or the science. It doesn't matter if you don't, you don't know enough about it. It's action. Action can come before awareness and education. It's action that really leads to building your confidence with this. It's action that leads to power. It's action that leads to finding your voice and putting pressure on governments. And ultimately, for 1 Million Women, it's action that leads to profound behaviour change. So, you know, I'm not a climate scientist. I don't even consider myself an activist. I'm just another member of society that has an obligation to do something. And 1 Million Women is all about that as well. So I think I probably talked 10 minutes, but that just gives you a bit of an insight of how it all started. Thank you.
I certainly have questions, Haley, but if we can pause and store the questions until the end, that would be wonderful. We move now, and we'll move through everyone first. Move to John Connor, which is a not inappropriate name for someone who deals in the future.
I had the name before the film.
True. John Connor is the CEO of the Climate Institute. He is a lawyer with a diverse background, including as a researcher for Dr. Peter MacDonald, the independent member for Manly, who held the balance of power with the minority New South Wales coalition government of the time. He is also a leader in environmental organisations, has been a leader in environmental organisations like the Australian Conservation Foundation, and was a co-convener of the Make Poverty History campaign while he was working at World Vision. John has also worked on numerous government advisory panels, most recently for the Prime Minister's Task Force on Energy Efficiency. He's also a member of Westpac's Customer Consultative Council, the Board of the Environment Defender's Office, the Commonwealth Government's NGO Roundtable on Climate Change, the New South Wales Government's Climate Council, and is a governator with the Australian Youth Climate Coalition. John joined the Institute in March 2007.
Thank you. Thank you. So, yeah, basically and if Natalie's not a role model, I don't know what a role model is, by the way. So I've been doing this game of advocacy, craft of advocacy is actually how I consider it now for 2 decades, and it's a blend of negotiation, policy and communication. And the Climate Institute is we describe ourselves as an independent research organisation, but in reality we're a research and communication organisation. We try to provide research and materials that are able to be used or abused out there. And the approach, I thought I'd just talk a bit about our approach to this in this context. And I guess it's driven by 2 things. One is a thought about the political economy, and the other is around behavioural psychology, trying to understand what drives individuals' actions, but it's also important to understand the political machinery. And it is the political economy stupid, if I can paraphrase Bill Clinton, because they are the power base, the institutions that define many of our cultural and individual interactions as well. And important to understand, particularly for Australia, that whilst we were settled or invaded, have you viewed in 1788, we started exporting coal in 1797. So they literally went up to the beach in Newcastle and put it in bags and exported to India. It's deeply ingrained in our culture and how we engage, but also that we have so many captains of industry who've built up our economy who refuse to believe that they've basically brought us to the brink of humanity. I might come back to that in a bit, but also want to talk about the behavioural psychology, and it's because it's not just the vested interests and the big polluters that we're struggling against, we're also struggling against our own humanity. And it's our humanity in that we have so many coping mechanisms, and Natalie took us through a few of those, and you experienced a few in the play, that filter out that sort of political, scientific and economic information that tries to prevent the puncture of our family and our friends and our comfort. It's that humanity we need to engage with. It's also the humanity that we as social animals have never really thought of ourselves as a species. We think of ourselves as individuals or members of family, tribes, cities or nations, but thinking about ourselves as species is a different thing and a very difficult thing to get to. And all of this has really been on display, in particular over this last few years, as we've descended into quite bitter tribalism and culture wars, in particular, after Abbott took over from Turnbull, and we lost at least a bipartisan approach to some of the fundamentals. Now, so engaging with that sort of tribalism and culture is very important, and in some ways, some of our activities and some of the activities we've all engaged with as activists have actually reinforced that, and particularly in the last year or so, as we sought to ensure that the carbon reforms, which were so disastrously labelled as a tax, because it was actually not correct either, but we sought to make sure that they weren't friendless, and we had to feed the media cycle in terms of engagement with matching our rallies with those of the anti-carbon tax rallies was actually critical in terms of how the politics worked and the gumption of the ALP, the independents as well as the Greens, in terms of actually portraying a broad base of public support, if not in retrospect doing as much as we would have liked to have done with engaging with mainstream culture. All of that has led, and one of the things that we do as Institute is do a lot of research and into attitudes and do focus groups and do polling and the like, and we do what we call Climate of the Nation. We did one which we released in July, which showed a number of things which were both disheartening and heartening. I think a couple of things is that that process has diseducated people. In fact, we've actually gone backwards in terms of understanding. We had some 60% of people who are confused about the science because of the competing voices. We have the number of people who believe humans are the main drivers of climate change descend, and so and people who accept that climate change is real descend from some over 8 in 10 to just over 5 in 10 in May of this year. All that's pretty challenging when you deal with some of those stats and seeing that sort of culture wars. But I guess there's a couple of things in terms of individual beliefs at the moment that's important to draw as a wellspring out of the data. One of which was that there was still 2/3 who thought the federal government should be doing something and taking action, which I think after all of how people are so sick of the politics was actually quite interesting. Another of which is that when it comes to the actual climate impacts in terms of things of the reef and food security and on farmers and farming, that's still at a very high level. So when you tell the story at that more individualised level and rather in the broad science and as it impacts individuals, still quite strong and very strong support for the transformation into renewable energy, and wind and solar in particular, very important. So there are things which we're all trying to work with in our broad campaigns. But I also want to just touch on things because we've talked a bit about behaviour here, and it's kind of there's like an iceberg in terms of that people talk about in terms of change and engagement, and where you've got beliefs and behaviour is sort of the iceberg above water. It's the culture underneath, the beliefs and the other activities that drive underneath that's actually also very important. So how do we engage with that? And our view from the research that we've done, for example, is that, and it's something that Ian struggled with in the play, is that we actually aren't going to scare people into sustained action. And we have a variety of bits and pieces of advice from advertisers and the like, and they talk about how hope and fear are the major drivers of behaviour. And they do change behaviour, but that can be an immediate and a transient thing. So how do we engage with these things in a much deeper way is the big challenge for all of us, and how do we sort of do the social climate rather than the social weather, which is the more day-to-day thing. So part of that is to, and we've been experimenting with this in a range of ways now, in changing the way in which we communicate to be much more visual, more dynamic, more human. And so you'll see a lot of our materials do that. We've actually engaged with the creative process. We've got our first creative fellow. The photo you saw at the start there was Michael Hall, who's our creative fellow, who's actually right now in China doing documenting a trip there, and we're trying to document the stories of what's going on there in China, because it's certainly very important. And we know in focus groups, and we had some horrible ones even just on Monday, where we're talking with some people out Hurstville way, that once you actually start talking about what is going on in China and what they're doing in terms of becoming a clean energy superpower, that changes the conversation. But we also do need to continue to talk to some of the realities about the costs of inaction. And we're doing that. We've got a big research project we're launching on Monday about the risks to our infrastructure and how prepared Australia should be prepared, because we've got such a history of extreme weather events, but we're actually poorly prepared in our basic infrastructure. And it is important to talk about the opportunities of action that's there in terms of what the new economy can be, and engage in a sense of prosperity, a new kind of prosperity that it has one that's engaged with the natural and cultural and social world. So I might shut up there, but I think it's actually, I guess the guts of that is that as new organisations we need to really think about how we engage the creative arts, the philosophy, the social sciences, as well as the environmental sciences as we engage out there in this debate, as we've got so much to do, and it's over a long period of time. It won't be done or fixed in a few years.
We will move on so we can permit some time for questions. And our final speaker on the panel today is Kirsty Albion, who is the now arrived co-director of the Australian Youth. This must only be like a day out of date. No, the co-director of the Australian Youth Climate Coalition. After 4 years working with the AYCC as grassroots coordinator and campaign manager. Through her work, she's managed the Walk for Solar project, which was a 300-kilometre walk with 100 people for Australia's first solar thermal plant in Port Augusta, and also the Meet Your Member campaign, where young people met with all 226 federal politicians about climate change. In 2010, Kirsty was awarded Young Australian of the Year for Tasmania for her work with the AYCC's program Project Survival Pacific, where she had the opportunity to work with youth in Fiji and help to start a Pacific youth climate movement. Kirsty Albion.
Hey, so a lot of you already know the Australian Youth Climate Coalition quite well, but today I want to just talk about how the AYCC and young people across the country are working to mainstream these issues of climate change and move people to action. So for those who don't know, the Australian Youth Climate Coalition is one of Australia's largest youth-run organisations, and our mission is to build a generation-wide movement to solve the climate crisis. And what that means to us is young people all across the country working in their local communities to change the hearts and minds of their local people, create change in those local areas, but then connect nationally to create political change on some of those big issues that are really important. Because we believe that in order to solve the climate crisis, what we're going to need to do is rapidly transition Australia away from one that is burning fossil fuels and exporting fossil fuels to one that's powered by 100% renewable energy. And that's going to need some really big changes to our policies. So AYCC really mobilises and empowers young people to create change locally and then communicate nationally and campaign nationally to create those policy changes. First of all, I just want to tell a bit about myself. So I grew up in Tasmania. Who's been to Tassie? Yeah, so you know it's the best place in the world. It's full of beautiful environmental places. And I grew up with the forests and the beaches. I was that 8-year-old who ran up to people in the national park and said, "Stop feeding the wildlife." Or I took a plastic bag in my bag to school and would take the long way home to walk along the mud flats to pick up rubbish. That was me. I very much cared about the environment, and so I moved to Melbourne to study environmental science. And like Natalie said, around 2007, when climate change was becoming a really big environmental issue, of course I got involved. I was learning about how half the species on our planet could be threatened with extinction in my lifetime, and the places I really cared about were threatened. So I joined the Australian Youth Climate Coalition because it was a place where young people can meaningfully get involved in climate action. And I expected to meet a whole bunch of other environmentalists, and one of the past AYCC staff just walked out, and I'm pretty sure he told me once he's allergic to the environment. Not everyone here, that's not the reason why all young people care about climate change, and John said this. Young people and people in Australia care about climate change for many reasons. I met people who really cared about it for social justice reasons. That's what motivated them to act, because I knew the most vulnerable in our societies would be affected first and worst by climate change. I met young people who came from rural areas, who'd seen the impacts of drought on their local communities, or people who'd come from places with extreme weather events like fires and floods. Young people care about climate change for many different reasons, and that's true across all Australians. So I think the first thing when we're thinking about how do we change people's behaviour in Australia, how do we get them active, is to recognise that there isn't a silver bullet. There's not going to be another inconvenient truth that magically gets everyone overnight believing climate change is important again and we need to do something and we need to create a transition to renewable energy. Instead, we're going to need to connect with each of those issues that matter to each individual. And it's really important to communicate those, not just through facts, because we're now in a society, like John said, where there are a lot of false facts in our society. There's been a strong campaign, a climate denialist campaign being run by vested interests who don't want climate action to say that climate change isn't real, and to put out false information and to create this sense of doubt in our society. So facts alone aren't going to be what changes people's minds. Instead, we need to focus on what does, and that under the iceberg stuff. It's the emotions, and it's the morals, and it's the values like responsibility and community, and it's the personal connections that are going to move people. So I want to tell a bit of a story about a project where we did this recently, and that was the Repower Port Augusta campaign. Put your hand up if you're involved in this campaign. I think there's probably quite a few. So as you know, in Port Augusta, there's 2 coal-fired power stations shutting down. And there's opportunity to build Australia's first solar thermal plant in Port Augusta. Now, as someone who cares passionately about climate change, this is great because it's going to reduce emissions. Building Australia's first solar thermal plant will show that it's possible to Australians. It'll also bring down the cost curve for these renewable energy technologies. Like, for me, that's really exciting, but that's not what motivated the local Port Augustans. For local Port Augustans, why we want renewable energy in Port Augusta is because of health. Because the coal dust is causing higher rates of cancer in the community than anywhere in Australia. It's because of jobs, because there are more jobs in solar thermal than there are in coal or gas. Because of the local environment, we had people who really care about replacing the coal with solar thermal because the trees are dying in the local community from the pollution. So when we started this campaign, what we did was we found those diverse spokespeople, the people who could connect to those stories. So for example, we had Liz, she's a nurse in Port Augusta, and she could talk about how there are high rates of asthma and respiratory disease in children, and that connected with people. We had the Mayor Joy Balouche come out and talk about why renewable energy was great, because for her, she was battling with cancer, lung cancer. Or Gary, he works in the coal station, and he could talk about why he wanted a job in clean renewable energy in Port Augusta and why that was so important. And that meant that as we ran this campaign and we had a community vote a few months back, when the community came out to vote, 99% voted for solar thermal, not gas. And it wasn't necessarily at the start because of climate change, it was because of those other issues. We communicated the things that mattered to them. But what was really amazing is as those stories kind of came out, a lot of those spokespeople's messages and their stories, they started connecting with climate change as well. And climate change for them, like you said, internalized it. And it became something that made sense locally why they wanted climate change solutions. And I guess it kind of shows that it's really important to have those spokespeople and to use those different messages. But in addition to having that, you also need a movement of people. And that's because the people that are trusted the most in Australian society are our friends and family. They're not scientists, and they're not necessarily your mayor or any politician, they're your friends and family. So we need people in every household, in every workplace, in every school who can say, actually, I really care about climate change and this is why. They need to be angsty teenagers who can talk to angsty teenagers. And they need to be young professionals who can talk to young professionals. And they need to be farmers who can talk to farmers. We need people in every community who are having those conversations and changing people's minds. And it's really powerful when you have it at an individual level, because you know that Fred really cares about this and you can talk to that, whereas Mary cares about this and you can speak to her values and her personal experience. So that's what the AYCC does. We're building a generation-wide movement to solve the climate crisis. And what that looks like is supporting young people in every community across Australia to change the hearts and minds of those around them, and then mobilise those people to create larger, broader political change. Because we know that, as well as knowing that it's important, we need people to have that hope and the solutions and to see how they're going to create change in their local communities, in their states, and in the national community as well. So we support young people in their communities, we outreach into new communities, and then we train those people up to re-communicate climate change to other people. So thanks for having us.
Before we throw open to some general questions, it might be a good time to throw a specific question to Ian, who's the writer of the page, because that you're talking about finding people that other people recognise to speak to them about the issue. One of the fascinating things about watching this show with a variety of audiences is seeing different people's point of entry to the show, and particularly different people's point of entry to different characters. So I was wondering, Ian, do you want to talk very briefly to your inspiration for writing it, if you like, or the reasons that you came to be interested in making a contribution to the question.
I also came to the issue of climate change, I guess, at around the same time as you guys are speaking about, in about 2005, where I'd always been I grew up in a coal mining town in Western Australia, so it was a Port Augusta, and there was my mother and father were kind of the only people in the town who weren't sort of coal miners or working in the power station down there, but they were quite environmentally aware and loved the bush around our property, and so I had a similar thing. It was not nearly as beautiful as Tasmania, but I had a real connection to the environment through my parents, but was kind of quite odd in the town in that everyone else, it was very much about coal mining and coal mining. We used to do these comprehension worksheets at school that were like why Griffin Coal was kind of the most amazing company and why coal was this kind of one of them. It was called Griffin Coal, yeah. I've never thought of that. So it's come full circle.
Get sponsored now.
Yeah. To the point where I told this sort of Sam the other day, but to the point where my mum advocated in our primary school for having energy efficient light bulbs put in, and the mayor of the town, who I think was also the headmaster at the time, kind of chastised her very angrily and said, "What are you trying to do? Are you trying to put the town out of business? You're trying to wipe all of our jobs away and put us off the map." So it was very, quite early on, I was kind of quite aware of this push and pull between, jobs and industry and coal, like John said, so sort of deeply ingrained, and the environment and what the kind of cost of that stuff was. Then jumped to sort of at university, and I can't remember why I kind of bought these books to begin with. There must have been something that kind of triggered that. I'm maybe seeing Tim Flannery speak comes to mind really early on. So reading The Weathermakers, and before that kind of reading things by Professor Ian Lowe, and these kind of, and James Hansen and stuff, sort of. Who's a NASA scientist who's sort of been the biggest kind of proponent of kind of climate change debate over the last sort of 20 years, I guess. So I started reading more of that literature, and at the same time was writing something about anxiety and about the kind of the hidden cost of anxiety, a generalised sort of anxiety, and anxiety that stems from trauma in lots of people that I was sort of friends with, and seeing how damaging that was at a personal level, but how well they seemed on the outside and how functional they were in their lives. And that seemed to me an interesting kind of analogy between the kind of how the world kind of seeming like it's in quite a good place at that time, but all of this stuff that sort of is sitting under the surface that's about to explode in kind of really damaging ways. So I thought that might be a really interesting analogy to take into a piece of fiction. I guess I was sort of wondering what I could kind of bring to the debate, and I'd be a terrible politician, and I was never really clever enough to be a scientist. So I sort of thought that maybe through the kind of the personal and the emotional, like you're saying, that kind of the internalising of the sort of science and the debate and the politics of it, I thought there might be a way that I could kind of add to the debate by bringing it down to a very sort of personal level, just between two people trying to figure out whether the future is kind of going to be one in which they can, have a family. So yeah, that was the kind of place that I sort of started writing from, and it was a screenplay for a long time. Then Sam came on board as a dramaturg of that screenplay, as a script editor, and when he became artistic director of Griffin, we talked a bit about turning it into a play, and so that's the sort of cycle that's gone over the last 7 years.
Yeah, well, we might. Thank you, Ian. We might. Preserve from talking for a bit, because you're going to go do it again soon. We might throw straight open to questions from the house. I've got some questions for the panellists, but if we, in the interests of hearing from you guys, does anyone have anything they want to ask straight off the bat from anyone on the panel? You probably need to raise your hand quite obviously. Down the front there.
What was your writing process over the last couple of years to get the play? So it was in terms of researching climate scientists and how they think and work, and
Yeah. I did a lot of research, also in sort of the insurance world and as well. I spoke to a number of climate scientists over the last 5 years. It's been really interesting to have spoken to people at different points in time over the kind of the way the kind of political cycle has developed as well. Because I was sort of speaking to people before that kind of the sense of, it didn't seem like it had exploded so much, but before that sense of denial, you know, before that sort of seed of doubt had been planted by a very small minority of you know, people who claim to kind of know about climate. But I spoke to a lot of people at the Bureau of Meteorology and the National Climate Centre, and then climate scientists like David Crowley, and lots of people in sort of public policy as well. Some people within the Department of Climate Change and Energy Efficiency kind of were very willing to speak, often off the record. But yes, it was that to me is the kind of most interesting part of the writing process, that kind of research period, and then you know, you go away and turn these masses of interviews. At the same time, actually, when I started writing it, the Garnaut report was still in the process of kind of being written, and so I spoke to a lot of the people, the scientists and people who work for like the Clinton Foundation, who were part of that group, and that was really interesting to speak to people then, and then to see how they then thought about it after the Garnaut report had come out, and you know, once those suggestions had been implemented or not implemented in the CPRS, and then once that fell down, you know, it was really interesting. And try to keep up with the writing of it to create something that felt like it wouldn't necessarily age you know, immediately in terms of the political cycle, but something that would kind of have resonance even if we sort of move on, because obviously you're writing it here, and you know when, you know, if the coalition win, you know, what will happen in terms of the, you know, the carbon tax. Yeah, so that was fascinating to get people's opinions over the course of the sort of political cycle. Yeah.
First thing we've got to do is get people to stop saying carbon tax.
It's not a tax. Carbon in my head.
Yeah. We have one down the front.
Anecdotally, there's a position where you've got enormous power against the climate movement. The enormous power being people who don't want behavioural change, as Natalie was talking about. They don't want people to change their behaviour. So there's billions of dollars in Australia, and God knows how many billions around the world, spent on advertising to keep people doing what they're doing today. And that's a very hard thing to change. When you think about it though, apart from terrorism, there's probably been 2 times that I can think of off the top of my head where people dropped everything and said, oh shit, we better fix this now. One was AIDS, and people would probably recall the Simon Reynolds advertisements of the Grim Reaper, which were, you know, instrumental in changing thinking about all that stuff. And the second was the Y2K, where there was an immediate threat, and everyone said, oh Christ, we've got to, you know, it was a non-existent threat as opposed to climate change, and then the Y2K thing never existed really. But an enormous amount of effort was put into stopping something, and everyone dropped what they were doing to solve this problem. So it's the immediacy of the threat that seems to cause action, and the need to prevent the people trying to prevent behavioural change. I don't have an answer, but you know, that, to me, that's the question. I mean, I don't know, how do you do that? Because it's great about all the grassroots, you know, families talking to each other, and I think that's important, and we do it. But it's to me, it's a kind of bigger thing.
And is the question there was the part of how do you
encourage
change when the threat is long term?
When the threat's long term, and what you're fighting against is enormous, and it's vested interests, but at every level in a sense, because you know they want you to stay as you are. What do you do about it? I don't have an answer.
Well, I guess our take on that. So,
but it can be done. This is my point.
Well, it has to be done.
It has to be done.
And even those examples are interesting when you look worldwide. So, I mean, part of the thing of 06 and 07, which is actually tragic in retrospect, is actually, even though at the time we were buffeted, we actually had a fairly free run the inconvenient truth and other things were good. It was less contested. It was really when the climate gate happened, just in the lead up to Copenhagen, and what an amazing king hit that was, which is still reverberating in different ways. And just speaking to someone from the UK, very powerful in the UK, because it was British scientists who were seen to be baddies. But when you look at AIDS in South Africa, for example, the campaign there, where the national leaders and others contested that early on, I think beetroot juice and other things could stop it, and all sorts of things. So so it's the contestation of that which impacted on those things. And Y2K is clearly the immediacy. The cliff was something which was quite important. I guess that's where you need, in our view, to have that political economy. Stupid. And that means we've got to recognise the forces that we're grappling with.
Who will know everything you're doing as you do it, as an idea is formulated by the various.
Pretty much. They've done much more research.
Exactly what's going on.
All those sorts of things, and they have that power. So I mean, I like to think about campaigning as three-dimensional. You've got a campaign around a policy. And you've got a campaign around changing the sort of the power architecture. So actually setting up things like OICC and 1 Million Women, fantastic additions to the landscape of power in this country. And in addition, we've seen the emergence of companies with skin in the game in the low carbon economy. And one of the most exciting moments for me in the emergence of the low carbon economy was when the renewable energy target, which was under threat it was about 2009, when we finally had AGL and Pacific Hydro standing up and saying, no, we're going to lose thousands of jobs here. So for the first time, we actually had that same old argument which has been bashed us in the head in our various bits of work, working for us with the jobs and the low carbon economy. Now that's still pretty heavy. We still see all the coal mining and the jobs and things that comes with that. So you've got to change some of that architecture. And then the third dimension is actually making sure we grow our organisations and our reach and do those sorts of things. So that's a few ways in which we engage with that. The other thing which I'm really, really excited about now, so you might have to stop me if I get talk too long about this, because it's actually what I think there's a profound change in capitalism going on at the moment. And that's because of the fact that you and I, as members of retirement funds, we own the economy. So there's in super funds and pension funds and sovereign wealth funds worldwide, there's $60 trillion, a big pool of capital, in which we are all invested either as taxpayers or particularly as members of pension funds. And those guys invest in about 50% of that is in high carbon assets. And depending on whether you listen to Deutsche Bank or others, it's 2 or 1% in low carbon solutions. But because they are what we call universal owners, and they've emerged, this is over the last 5 years they've emerged, even like they weren't as relevant in the Asian crisis as they were in the GFC and the like. Because they own all the asset classes, they're involved across the whole economy. And so the old days of the Rockefellers and the Reinhardts from your backyard, where you privatise the gains and socialise the losses, is a failed model for them because they have to bear the losses on the other side. Now what they haven't got is the consciousness at the moment, not engaging with that in terms of climate as much as they should. But we are starting to see it in terms of executive remuneration, starting to see them take on, a number of them took on Rupert's ownership in News Corp and those sorts of things. So we've just been working on an asset owners disclosure project, and we've just launched something which is called the Vital Few, which is actually enabling you and people here to actually hassle your super fund and say, well, are you disclosing how much you've got in your portfolio in terms of emissions, and how much are you hedging in the low carbon economy? So these are some of the new things I think that we need to be doing, as well as building those things.
Enormously powerful, because the people who run the major super funds today aren't remunerated in any way by anything other than
it's short term,
it's a short 3-month game.
That goes through so much that's wrong in our society at the moment.
Shall we just, if you guys are okay, do you want to speak to that, Griffin? We might jump over here.
Oh no, I was just going to bring it back to supporting John in terms of what 1 Million Women does on a really personal level. Is we try to rise above all the noise on this. We try to just say, okay, this is about what you do in your life. In Australia, an incredibly wasteful society, and we waste 20% of the food that we buy. That's 1 in 5 shopping bags. We waste 13% of the electricity we pay for. We're an incredibly wasteful society, and I think that from from that perspective, we focus just on that. So it actually brings it back to what you can do, no matter what, no matter what's going on politically.
We might, if you're okay, Kirsty, we move to the other questions from the gentleman. And already have one over there coming. We'll go here first.
Yeah, I find myself it's quite difficult to talk to people about climate change because it always ends up being quite complex. If you're interested in it and you read up on it and you give people whole facts and figures, they sort of look at you like you're a crank, you know. So keeping it really simple is an incredibly difficult thing to do. It's an inherently very complex thing. It involves economies and massive amounts of money, huge vested interests. You've got media moguls and you've got crazy 2GB, Alan Joneses and people like that, who are really spreading all this rubbish to a massive slice of baby boomers. And if you talk to any of those people and try to convince them, they're actually really, really radical in their thinking. And it's quite difficult to cut through that, right? So how do you think is the best way to keep it really simple where you can get people on board? I see that as a really big problem because there's a massive complacency out there.
Yes, absolutely.
So yeah, I think this is really common in the climate movement, who just like has that moment when you want to engage in a conversation on climate change and then just can't because it's too emotional. It's really hard. And I think for those of us who commit so much of our day-to-day life, it's really hard to have a really flippant conversation about climate change and that sort of thing. But I guess that's kind of sometimes where I come from. Like sometimes you just talking to someone who's like, I can't engage in this debate today. But
and can I say, is that often a denier, as it were, or is that
yeah, or just someone who just is questioning you, like, well, what about this? What about that? What about this? You just, I can't do this today. I'm tired. But what inspires me is my sister's the exact opposite. My sister is, she was 17, she's that angsty teenager I was talking about. She kind of didn't really do that well in school, she was an emo, she like wore hair over her eyes. But when she was 17, I convinced her to come to PowerShift. And she came to PowerShift, which is our National Youth Summit. We come together, 1,000 young people all around the country, talking about climate change and learning about the solutions. And then she went back to Tassie. And 3 years later, she's just an average girl. She works in Hudson's. She's still a bit angsty, and she has lots of like posts on Facebook about song lyrics and that sort of thing. but when someone talks to her about it, like I can follow her into a shop and someone can say, I don't know, someone can make some offhand comment about climate change, she can get right back on it. And she can have that conversation, and she can do it in a way that isn't really earnest in the way that sometimes I find myself doing. But it's in that way that's like, shut up, like that's stupid, like this is the reality. I'm someone you trust, I'm someone who has a relationship with you, and I'm a cool person, like I still have a normal life, but I really care about climate change and it's really important, and this is what we need to do. We need to transition to 100% renewable energy. And I think what we need to do is, as people who really care about it, is get other people to be able to communicate it really well. Like we need to embed in tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of people. How do you communicate climate change effectively to the people that you communicate well to? Because sometimes it's a bit hard to have those conversations on the small, like this group of people, feeling like we have to have all those conversations every day. What we need to do is train other people to do it and cut through that complexity and connect to people's values again, connect to the personal stories and say like, it's not about the science, it's about I do this because I care about this and this is something I know you care about as well. It
may be, to briefly digress into this particular context and your question, in some ways the making of the show was that the challenge that you identify in microcosm and specifically that section that involves the debate with the denier. And there was a lot of development when we were developing the story, and when Ian was developing that section, a lot of discussion went on about how much detail do we want in here? What is the relationship between the detail of that and the kind of entertainment of the experience that will actually hopefully advocate the cause better possibly than the kind of extent of detail in there. So it was an interesting challenge to navigate in and out in the sort of specific theatrical terms here. We might have time for one more over there.
What I was going to comment on, I guess, was the talking before about personal epiphany and personal somehow understanding that, and what is incredibly complicated, or almost too complicated to really understand in detail. Like for me, I don't understand the spaceship, but I can understand what it does. And so that sort of level of actually understanding and knowing it, with the other sort of approaches, which is I was really inspired by what you're saying about also talking about the other things, and in a way what you're also saying about just cutting waste, which is just going back to those good old-fashioned basics about don't be wasteful. It's just ridiculous. It's silly. You're wasting your money and so on. But also bringing people on board by talking about the other issues and allowing climate change to come through as a natural follow-on. Because I'm assuming, I've only been to Portugal once a long time ago, but I would say that it would traditionally not be a community interested in climate change and be very rejecting of that. But is this what you were saying before? Is this the future of where climate change isn't something about the film and the polar bear or the ice floe disappearing and so on because we all believe in climate change, but we have to actually be much more subtle about getting the activism across, packaged with other things that people will take on board.
And being aware that it's an umbrella issue, and being aware it's a symptom of greater social ills in our society, climate change, is that, and I think when we look at the solutions, what we need to do is transition Australia to renewable energy. So it's closing down coal-fired power stations in our country and replacing them. And at that level, it's very local, it's very regional. We need to have these conversations and make sense of climate change in a way that makes sense locally. So in Queensland, it's about the Great Barrier Reef, the impacts climate change has on that, but also the impacts the coal ships have on that, and the ports have on that, and the oil spills have on that. And that's really important to connect, I think, with people, and really, just recognising climate change is important to people for so many different reasons, and it's so all-consuming in our society. It impacts everyone, and everyone in some way contributes to climate change. So recognising that and finding a way to make it personal, I think, is really important.
And whatever entry point into this is one we'll take on board.
Yeah, I think you got to, because there's actually vigorous debate in the climate movement about how much you stress on these things, and some who say we're bright-siding if we just talk about the positives and don't talk about all the realities. I think you do need to season all of those conversations with that, and it's the trick to get the right garnish right in a way. But I also think, I describe myself as a professional optimist, and so actually you've got to look at this as sort of, but that action on this is actually a solutions multiplier. It will enable us to be more empowered as citizens and better connected and all these things. There's a whole range of things which we can engage with that, and it's very important to have that perspective, at least for me, as we engage with the challenge.
Wonderful. Well, we might, on that note, regrettably we need to get this particular event set up again for another show. So tonight, it's absolutely wonderful for us in our creative arts contribution to this question, to get to surround that contribution with such expertise and knowledge and passion. So can you join me in thanking Ryder and Kirsty Albion, John Connor and Natalie Isaacs.